When it comes time to write the history of a school, it's usually at a monumental milestone date such as the 25th or the 50th or the 100-year anniversary and so on. And I get asked all the time, what should we do? How should we begin? What are the questions we should ask? Well, what I've noticed again and again actually is principals and boards ask this immediate question, who's going to write it? And then after they've decided who's going to write it, what kind of history do we want and for what purpose? Now, these questions really should be the other way around. So I'm going to begin with the second question. What is the point of a school history? A commission's history of a school will be about creating a monument for a special moment. It's going to seek to celebrate a school, to pay tribute to its legacy and its significance, which is to say, a celebration of its people. An effective school history invites everyone associated, past, present, future, to find their place in a narrative, in something really special. In fact, this is what all good history is like. We seek to find a face in the past in which we recognise our own. And by doing this, understand more about ourselves and where we fit into the world. I like to say there's 4 laws of writing a school history. Firstly, it needs to be easy to read and perhaps even entertaining. The book needs to be rigorous enough for scholars, long into the future, but scholars are not the main audience. Secondly, it needs to have a wide reach of accurate detail that reaches as widely as possible. The first thing most people will do when they pick up a school history is turn to the part where the history or the dates where the history involves themselves, even searching for their own name or their own photograph. School histories always involve the experience of nostalgia for most readers. Thirdly, it needs to be truthful. It needs to be able to stand up to being tested and tested hard. For a history to have an enduring impact, its readers, general or scholarly, need to be convinced it is a balanced account of the past and not just spin. The immersive, nostalgic experience is lost if the reader starts to mistrust the story. Finally, it needs to stand the test of time. The monument that is built to celebrate this particular anniversary needs to be the foundation for the monument that is built at the next anniversary, 25, 50 or 100 years into the future. So how are these 4 laws achieved? Well, easy to read history is not made easily. A good history of a school will be far more complex in its design than it appears or than it should appear. And this is a crucial thing to understand. Underneath every easy-to-read history that stands the test of time is a complex science. I'm going to use a couple of technical words now, but bear with me. I promise I'll get back to not using them. Good history writing is actually guided by a technical academic discipline called historiography, the science of writing about history. A science learnt and expertly practiced by professional, academically trained and published historians. All good histories should be based on a very deliberate historiography, or perhaps a blend of 2 or 3 compatible ones, depending on the topic. Deliberately choosing these, working out which ones to choose out of many, many, many different historiographies that have been used over the last 500 years, forms a foundation that means the book will stand the test of time. Secondly, if the history involves interviews with living people, then we've shifted across to a different discipline that's called the human sciences. And its equivalent of historiography, if you like, is called research methodology. Truthfully and ethically gathering information from living participants is actually a highly technical profession. It's not just a case of sitting down and having a chat with someone. And thirdly, school history needs to be written with a technical understanding of education, including pedagogy, curriculum, government education policy, and broad education history. Look, don't worry. Most historiography, research methodology, and curriculum theory should hardly ever appear in the text of a commissioned school history. But these things nonetheless silently guide the words that appear on every page. It is impossible to write a good history without them and without a good selection and understanding of them. But really, David, is all this technical stuff necessary? Well, in a word, yes. And let me illustrate the point. Consider whether an amateur hobbyist should be resolving the following tricky questions. What sources should be trusted? How is that to be determined? And where are they to be found? When there are far too many sources to include, how does a writer fairly choose to exclude a source? How do you write about an important thing for which there are hardly any or no reliable sources remaining? When something is contested in the sources, how do you decide which side is right? When a dark or difficult event perches in the history of a school, as they do in most schools, should that be written about? And if so, how? When might a text be likely to attract litigation? And how do we balance that risk with telling the truth? How do you write about religion in the history of a faith-affiliated school? Are we writing for the faithful or for all faiths and none? Should the history focus on key individuals or should it focus on key groups or both? Should the focus also notice those groups who are usually invisible in histories? How should the chapters be structured and why? Should it be a straight chronological account or a thematic account in parallel? To what extent should the school be explained in the context of broader social or even international historical forces? And how can you guarantee that the writer knows about them? What if the writer themselves has a bias, such a historical connection to the school? How do they manage that bias? If there are interviews conducted with living people, then how can we ensure the interviews were ethical? And who keeps the writer accountable about those ethics? How do we discern and what do we do when interviewees are perhaps, and this happens, being economic with the truth? What does the writer do if an interviewee goes off into a highly emotional state? And this happens in interviews when people are recalling the past. How do we ask questions that gather truth rather than merely confirm our own angle? How is one curriculum different to another? And what impacts do various curricula have on school cultures and student outcomes? All of these questions, and many more, would surface in the writing of any school history. Addressing these questions would tie most people up in a tangle. But it is the bread and butter of a professional historian. So let's go back to where we began. This all leads us to the other question that principals and boards ask first. Who should we get to write the history? Can I just note at this point that it is important to understand that the purpose of a history of a school should not be primarily to advertise the school. Many schools have short, glossy, coffee table type books that depict the past of the school in a caricature of its best light. The kind of book that you want for the school foyer, the kind that a prospective school enrolment parent will thumb through while they're waiting for the enrolment interview. It will contain some good photos of days gone past, a brief chronology, and some anecdotes from former students, and an appealing magazine-style layout. These books generally do not have citations or footnotes, which are essential for testing the validity of a written account about the past. And they don't need them. Its purpose is not history. Its purpose is sales. One of the biggest mistakes that boards and principals make when thinking about a history is the coffee table book trap. These books do not make an enduring impact and are soon forgotten. For younger schools, particularly on a tighter budget, and I've seen this again and again, the first instinctive answer is to suggest a retired or soon-to-be retired history teacher, usually a colleague of the principal, sometimes a retiring principal, associated with the school in some way. Hey, they might even do it for free as a retirement hobby. How hard can it be? You just put all the school principals in chronological order with a chapter each, a photo at the front of the chapter, and hey presto, job done. However, writing a good history is actually a professional skill. What they write needs to be able to be enjoyed by a general audience, but also reliable and valid for scholarly purposes to stand the test of time. It is important to understand, and I say this with the greatest of respect, that most history teachers are generally not actually historians. Professional education historians have doctorates in history and education. They have been published in peer-reviewed journals and books, and taught and researched history at university level. History teachers, rather, are that most important creature. Professionals who teach students, many of whom are not there voluntarily, how to study and understand history. Indeed, history written by professional historians, and without one, you could not have the other. I say this as someone who's been both a history teacher and a published historian, but this blend is much rarer than most people would think in schools. Who should write it then? Well, firstly, I'd suggest a professional historian, ideally, but not essentially, very familiar with schools and education. However, it is also crucial that the historian is an accomplished writer for a general audience. A high academic history can be as dry as sandpaper, written just with scholarship in mind. Indeed, there are a few school histories floating around that shall remain nameless, which are great for people like me, education historians, but remain unreadable for most of the population. Writing is an art in itself, most particularly how to brutally edit your own text into a sharp, clear phrase that will ring through a crowd and down through the ages. It is an aesthetic skill, and all good monuments need to be aesthetic as well as truthful. But is all of this necessary? What is the harm in taking the obvious option and getting a retired teacher to write the history? Look, it might be fine. They might be very accomplished. However, another more likely outcome may be a history that principals and boards are not happy with mistakes and with perhaps even legal liabilities, which all becomes pretty awkward, particularly if the writing is by a friend. Boards and principals then need either to sink more costs into going back and forth with the writer, or write it off completely and lose the opportunity to monumentalise that special occasion, or have to pay a professional to rewrite or hard edit the text. Like the time I tried, against everyone else's advice, to sand my own timber floors. The cost of trying to do it cheaply may well be eventually more expensive than getting it done professionally in the first place. So these are some ideas to help boards and schools decide how to proceed with commissioning a school history. Look, it's a great thing to do, very significant for a culture as it matures. If, as a principal, you have enjoyed building capital works, this carries a similar delight of creating something permanent outside of the busyness of the today that cannot be taken away, a beautiful legacy that helps in the formation of children, families, communities, and the nation.